The rebellion wasn't just a military force. It was a patchwork of scavengers, idealists, and broken souls who chose hope when the galaxy offered none. But what if the real story isn't about their victories at all, but about the thousands of quiet sacrifices made in shadows we never saw? Welcome, friend, to a journey through the stars. Before we drift into the galaxy far, far away, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Are you tucked into bed in a quiet corner of Earth? Or perhaps relaxing under your own night sky? Wherever you are, you're about to discover the hidden heart of Star Wars, the brave souls who dared to stand against darkness when hope seemed lost. The rebellion wasn't always the shining symbol we know today. In the very first drafts of Star Wars, George Lucas barely mentioned these freedom fighters at all. The story focused on other things, on Jedi and princes and political games. But something kept pulling Lucas back to an idea that wouldn't let go. He thought about the small groups of people throughout history who stood up to powerful empires. He remembered the stories his father told him. He watched old war films where brave pilots flew against impossible odds. And slowly, gently, the rebellion began to take shape in his mind. Lucas grew up in a time when the world felt heavy with conflict. The Vietnam War filled the news every night. Young people questioned authority and marched for change. Meanwhile, Lucas watched classic films from World War II, where scrappy Allied forces fought against overwhelming military might. He saw how those old movies made audiences feel something deep inside, a stirring of courage and hope. He wanted to capture that same feeling, but set it among the stars where it could become timeless, where it could belong to everyone, no matter when they watched it or where they came from. In those early days of creating Star Wars, Lucas wrote and rewrote the opening scenes. At first, the movie started differently. There was no mention of a rebellion at all, just vague talk of unrest in the galaxy. But as he worked, the idea grew stronger. What if there were ordinary people, not powerful Jedi or mystical warriors, but regular folks who simply said no to evil? What if they flew old ships and wore mismatched uniforms and had to scavenge for every weapon? What if they were us, thrown into an adventure bigger than ourselves? The inspiration came from many places. Lucas studied the American Revolution, where farmers and merchants fought the most powerful empire on Earth. He read about the French resistance in World War II, brave citizens who sabotaged Nazi operations at great personal risk. He thought about the Viet Cong, who, regardless of politics, showed how a smaller force could challenge a superpower through cleverness and determination. All these real struggles blended together in his imagination, creating something new yet somehow familiar. Some believe Lucas encoded even deeper meanings into the rebellion's creation. Film historians have noticed how the Empire's uniforms look remarkably like Nazi officers, all cold grays and blacks in rigid formation. Meanwhile, the rebels wear orange flight suits and brown vests, warm colors that feel alive and human. The Empire builds giant weapons that destroy entire planets. The rebels fly small ships, protecting rather than destroying. Every choice, some say, reflected Lucas's hope that good people could resist evil systems, that warmth could outlast cold machinery. When audiences first saw Star Wars in 1977, something magical happened. People connected immediately with these underdog fighters. They cheered when X-Wings screamed across the screen. They held their breath during the Death Star trench run. They felt what Lucas hoped they would feel, that rush of standing up for what's right even when you're outmatched. Children left theaters wanting to be rebel pilots. Adults remembered what it felt like to believe in heroes again. The nostalgia of that moment still echoes today. Do you remember the first time you saw those rebel ships? The way they looked worn and real, like they'd actually flown through space battles? The way the pilots joked with each other before heading into danger? There was something so human about it all, so different from the cold perfection of the Empire. Lucas had created freedom fighters we could believe in, could imagine ourselves among. And so the rebellion was born, not from one single idea, but from many threads woven together: historical struggles and classic cinema, personal beliefs and universal hopes. The simple but powerful notion that ordinary people, working together, can challenge even the darkest forces. As we settle deeper into our journey tonight, let that thought comfort you. The rebellion started small, just like every great movement in history. It started with people who cared, who chose courage over comfort. And from that choice, a galaxy was saved. The rebellion didn't just need a story. It needed to look real, to feel like something you could reach out and touch. But in 1976, George Lucas faced a challenge that would shape everything we know about Star Wars. He had big dreams, but a small budget. The studio gave him only $11 million to create an entire galaxy. Most Hollywood films spent that much just on costumes and sets. Lucas had to build spaceships, aliens, planets, and the technology of the future with barely enough money to make one normal movie. This problem became the rebellion's greatest gift. Because Lucas couldn't afford shiny, perfect special effects, he had to make everything look used and worn. And that choice, born from necessity, made the galaxy feel alive in a way no science fiction film had before. The team at Industrial Light and Magic, Lucas's new special effects company, became masters of making the new look old. They took model spaceships fresh from the workshop and attacked them with sandpaper. They painted them, then scratched the paint away. They added blast marks with tiny blowtorches. They glued random pieces of plastic model kits onto the surfaces, creating details that suggested repairs and modifications done in a hurry. The X-Wing fighter started as a simple sketch on paper. Designer Colin Cantwell drew a dart-shaped ship with wings that could split apart. But when the model makers built it, they didn't make it sleek and clean. They made it look like a working vehicle, something a real pilot would climb into after mechanics had patched it together one more time. Each X-Wing model, only 2 feet long, carried hundreds of tiny details, little panels that looked like they could open for repairs, scorch marks near the engines, dirt in the crevices. When filmed against a black background with careful lighting, these small models looked massive and real, like they weighed several tons and had flown 1,000 missions. The rebel pilots themselves wore costumes that told stories without words. Costume designer John Mollo studied real fighter pilots from World War II. He noticed how their gear never matched perfectly. One pilot might wear a British life vest with an American helmet. Another might have a scarf from home tucked into a standard issue flight suit. So Mollo created the same feeling for the rebellion. Each pilot's costume had pieces that looked gathered from different sources. Orange flight suits came from one supplier. Helmets looked borrowed from various ships. Some pilots wore vests, others didn't. Gray gloves mixed with brown ones. Nothing matched, and that made everything feel true. This weathering process, as the team called it, extended to every corner of the rebellion. The briefing room on Yavin 4 wasn't filled with gleaming new computers. The screens looked old, the chairs mismatched, the walls stained from years of use. When you see rebel technicians working on equipment, their tools appear battered and repaired many times over. Even the Millennium Falcon, though not officially a rebel ship, showed this philosophy perfectly. Han Solo's freighter looked like it might fall apart at any moment, held together with spare parts and desperate hope. Some believe this aesthetic choice carried deeper meaning than just saving money. By making rebel technology look salvaged and repaired, Lucas showed us something important about resistance itself. The Empire could afford new equipment, perfect uniforms, and gleaming star destroyers. The rebellion had to make do with whatever they could find. They weren't fighting with matching resources. They were fighting with determination and cleverness, fixing what broke and flying what others had thrown away. Every scratch on an X-wing told the story of survival. Every mismatched uniform represented a person who chose the cause over comfort. The designers faced constant creative challenges that pushed them toward brilliant solutions. When they needed to show a fleet of rebel ships, but couldn't afford to build dozens of models, they filmed the same few models multiple times from different angles. When they wanted explosions in space, they developed new techniques using backlit cotton and careful photography. Each limitation forced innovation, and each innovation made the rebellion feel more authentic. The team learned that perfection looks fake, but wear and tear looks real. Behind the scenes, the model makers developed special techniques that became industry standards. They discovered that spraying models with a mix of black and brown paint, then wiping most of it away, created shadows in all the tiny details. They learned exactly how much weathering looked realistic without making ships seem ready for the junkyard. They found that adding small red and yellow lights to models suggested complex systems working inside, giving life to miniatures that were mostly hollow plastic and foam. This crafted imperfection became the visual language of hope struggling against power. And as the camera panned across those weathered rebel ships preparing for battle, audiences understood without being told. These were heroes who fought with what they had, not what they wished for. And somehow, that made their courage mean even more. The rebellion's story didn't end when the credits rolled on A New Hope. It had only just begun. Over the decades that followed, the tale of these brave freedom fighters grew and deepened, spreading across films and shows and stories until we understood them in ways that first audience in 1977 never could. Each new chapter revealed another layer, another sacrifice, another reason why ordinary people chose to stand against the darkness. 3 years after the Death Star exploded, audiences returned to theaters for The Empire Strikes Back. The film opened on the ice planet Hoth, and immediately we saw how much the rebellion had changed. They weren't celebrating their victory anymore. They were hiding in frozen caves, running from the Empire's fury. The movie showed us something important about resistance that the first film couldn't. Winning one battle doesn't win the war. The rebellion had struck a mighty blow, but now they paid the price. Star destroyers hunted them across the galaxy. Every day brought new danger, new losses. The tone had shifted from triumph to survival, and audiences felt the weight of that change. Empire gave us our first real look at rebel leadership beyond the heroes we knew. Admiral Ackbar appeared briefly, his alien face suggesting the diversity of the Alliance. General Riecken commanded the Hoth base with calm authority, making impossible decisions about when to evacuate and who would cover the retreat. We saw dozens of rebel soldiers manning gun turrets and piloting snow speeders, each one a person with a life and a reason for fighting. When those giant walkers stomped across the ice and rebels died in explosions of snow and fire, the cost became real in a new way. This wasn't an adventure anymore, it was a war, and war meant loss. Return of the Jedi brought the original trilogy to a close 3 years later, showing the rebellion at its most organized and most desperate. The attack on the second Death Star required every ship the Alliance could muster. In the briefing scene, we finally saw the full scope of their forces. Mon Mothma, dressed in flowing white robes, explained the mission with quiet strength. Admiral Ackbar laid out the tactical plans. Dozens of pilots from different species listened intently, knowing many wouldn't return. The movie showed us that the rebellion had grown from scattered cells into a true military force, but also that this growth had come at tremendous cost. Every ship in that fleet represented years of secret construction. Every pilot represented a family somewhere hoping for their return. Then the rebellion disappeared from screens for many years, living only in books and comics that devoted fans cherished. But in 2008, something wonderful happened. The Clone Wars animated series began, and though it was set before the rebellion existed, it showed us how the seeds were planted. We met Saw Gerrera, a young fighter on Onderon who learned guerrilla tactics from the Jedi. We saw Senator Bail Organa quietly helping those who opposed the Chancellor's growing power. We watched as characters who would become rebel founders first learned what it meant to resist tyranny. The show gave context to the rebellion's birth, showing that it didn't appear suddenly but grew slowly from many small acts of defiance. Rebels, the animated series that aired from 2014 to 2018, finally showed us what we'd always wondered about. How did the rebellion actually form? The show followed a single rebel cell on the planet Lothal, just a handful of people with one old freighter and a dream of freedom. Over 4 seasons, we watched them connect with other cells, saw the network grow, and witnessed the moment when scattered resistance groups became the alliance to restore the Republic. The series introduced us to rebels who never appeared in the movies but whose sacrifices made the movies possible. Hera Syndulla, a Twi'lek pilot whose skill rivaled any ace. Kanan Jarrus, a Jedi survivor who taught a new generation. Ezra Bridger, a street kid who became a hero. Their story made the rebellion feel personal again, reminding us that grand movements start with small groups of friends who refuse to give up. But perhaps no addition to the rebellion story hit harder than Rogue One in 2016. The film answered a question fans had joked about for decades. How did the rebels get the Death Star plans? The opening crawl of A New Hope mentioned it so casually, as if stealing the Empire's most secret weapon. Blueprints was just another day's work. Rogue One showed the terrible truth. Getting those plans required a mission so dangerous that everyone knew it was one way. No extraction, no rescue. Just a slim chance to give the rebellion hope, purchased with everything they had. The movie introduced us to Jyn Erso, daughter of the Death Star's designer, and Cassian Andor, a rebel spy who'd done dark things for the cause. It showed us that the rebellion wasn't always noble and clean. Sometimes rebels had to make hard choices, to do things that kept them awake at night. The Alliance Intelligence Network, we learned, could be ruthless when necessary. But Rogue One also showed the beauty of sacrifice. On the planet Scarif, a small team fought their way to the plans while a desperate space battle raged overhead. One by one they fell, and as the Death Star's beam swept across the beach, destroying the Imperial facility and the rebels alike, we finally understood the true cost of that opening crawl. Every fact in Princess Leia's databanks was paid for in blood. Then came Andor in 2022. A show that changed how we saw everything. Set 5 years before A New Hope, it showed the rebellion at its earliest, most fragmented stage. The series revealed something profound. Most rebels didn't start as heroes. They started as ordinary people pushed too far. Cassian himself began as a thief just trying to survive. The show explored how the Empire's casual cruelty created its own enemies, how everyday injustices built into revolutionary fire. It was slower, quieter, more thoughtful than other Star Wars stories. And it reminded us that behind every X-Wing pilot and every soldier, there was a person who made a choice. A moment when they decided that staying silent hurt more than speaking up. That comfort meant nothing if others suffered. Across all these stories, through films and animated series and shows, the rebellion revealed itself fully, not as a simple tale of good against evil, but as a complex web of choices and sacrifices, victories and losses, hope and cost. And as we drift deeper into the night, we carry these stories with us, understanding now what the rebellion truly meant. It meant people who kept trying even when trying seemed pointless. It meant holding on to hope even when hope seemed foolish. It meant believing that together, ordinary beings could accomplish the impossible. The rebellion needed more than ships and soldiers. It needed places to hide, to plan, to breathe between battles. Across the galaxy, scattered on forgotten worlds and hidden moons, the Alliance found sanctuary in the most unlikely corners. These bases told their own story, a tale of adaptation and survival, of making homes in places no one else wanted. Each location reflected the desperate creativity of people who had to stay one step ahead of an empire that never stopped hunting. Yavin 4 became the rebellion's heart in those early days, though no one would have chosen it if they'd had better options. The moon orbited a massive gas giant, its jungles thick and humid and filled with creatures left over from ancient times. But beneath the choking vines and moss-covered stones stood something remarkable. Temples built by the Massassi, a civilization that vanished thousands of years before. The great temple rose above the jungle canopy, its stone blocks fitted so perfectly that not even jungle roots could pull them apart. The rebellion saw what the empire missed. These weren't just ruins. They were ready-made fortresses with rooms large enough for command centers and briefing halls. The stone kept the base cool despite the jungle heat outside. The height gave sensor operators a clear view of approaching ships, and the location, far from major trade routes, meant the empire might never think to look there. Inside the great temple, rebel technicians worked magic with salvaged equipment. They ran power cables along walls carved with mysterious symbols. They set up computer terminals in chambers where ancient priests once performed ceremonies no one remembered. The main hangar occupied what had once been a grand hall, its ceiling so high that X-wings could stack on multiple levels. Mechanics shouted to each other over the echo of their own voices. The smell of fuel and welding torches mixed with jungle moisture that seeped through every crack. It wasn't comfortable, but it was theirs. And from this unlikely home, they planned the attack that destroyed the Death Star. When the Empire learned of Yavin 4, the rebellion scattered like seeds on the wind. Some went to Hothbe, a planet so cold and remote that even the Empire's vast sensor network struggled to find them there. The sixth planet in its system, Hoth, was nothing but ice and snow and howling winds that could freeze a person solid in minutes. No native civilization had ever developed there. Nothing grew in the endless white. But that emptiness became the rebellion's shield. The Alliance burrowed into the ice like creatures hibernating through an eternal winter. They carved Echo Base from a network of ice caves, using thermal heaters to keep the tunnels barely warm enough for humans to survive. The design philosophy on Hoth was pure function. No decoration, no comfort, just the bare minimum needed to keep people alive and equipment working. Thick blast doors protected the main hangar, doors that looked like they weighed 100 tons. Inside, tauntauns, the native reptilian creatures, provided transportation across the ice fields, their breath steaming in the frigid air of the hangar. Medical bays treated frostbite as commonly as blaster wounds. Power generators hummed constantly, fighting against the cold that wanted to claim everything. The rebels wore heavy coats even indoors, their breath visible in rooms that should have been heated. Some believe the Hoth base represented the rebellion at its most desperate, willing to endure any hardship to stay free. The ice caves themselves held a strange beauty. Natural formations created cathedral-like chambers that the rebels barely had to modify. Icicles hung from ceilings like chandeliers made by a frozen artist. The walls glowed blue-white when lights shone through them, giving everything an ethereal quality. But this beauty came with constant danger. The ice shifted and groaned. Avalanches threatened to seal tunnels. The rebels posted guards not just for Imperial troops, but for Wampus, massive predators that hunted in the storms outside. Echo Base wasn't a home. It was a trap they hoped to spring on themselves' terms, and when those Imperial walkers appeared on the horizon, everyone knew their time had run out. Dantooine appeared only briefly in the films, mentioned as the location of a previous rebel base that the Empire had found abandoned. But expanded stories revealed its importance. A quiet agricultural world in the Outer Rim. Dantooine seemed too peaceful for war. Rolling plains stretched to distant horizons. Small farms dotted the landscape. The rebels chose it precisely because it seemed so innocent. They built their base inside ancient ruins, similar to Yavin 4, hiding their presence among stone walls that predated the Republic itself. The design allowed them to evacuate quickly when necessary, leaving behind empty halls that told the Empire nothing useful. The Dantooine base showed the rebellion's philosophy in action. Stay mobile, stay hidden. Never commit to a location so deeply that leaving becomes impossible. Throughout the galaxy, dozens of smaller outposts served specific purposes. Some were just refueling stations, hidden in asteroid fields where sensors couldn't penetrate the radiation. Others were supply depots, warehouses built into canyon walls or underwater caves. A few served as communication relays, sending encrypted messages between cells that might never meet face to face. Each location required careful selection.
Too close to Imperial space, and they'd be discovered. Too far from civilization, and they couldn't gather supplies or recruits. The rebels became experts at finding the balance, at seeing potential in places others dismissed as worthless. The mobile fleet bases represented another strategy entirely. Some rebel groups never settled on planets at all. They lived aboard modified cargo ships and old Republic cruisers, constantly moving through hyperspace. These floating bases carried entire communities, families, and technicians and soldiers all crammed into ships designed for much smaller crews. Children grew up never touching solid ground. Mechanics performed repairs in zero gravity between jumps. The ships would gather in deep space, empty regions between stars where the Empire rarely patrolled,
to share supplies and information before scattering again. It was a hard life, rootless and uncertain, but it kept them alive. The lesser-known sanctuaries held stories that rarely reached official histories. On Krayt, rebels built a base inside salt-covered plains, the minerals hiding their presence from sensors. On Atollon, they found safety on a remote coral planet, living among stone formations that looked like frozen trees. Each refugee reflected the same desperate ingenuity, the same refusal to give up even when the galaxy offered no welcome. The rebellion's bases weren't mighty fortresses. They were proof that determined people could make a stand anywhere, that walls and weapons mattered less than the will to keep fighting. And as you settle deeper into rest tonight, imagine those hidden sanctuaries scattered across the stars, each one a small light refusing to go out in the darkness. The rebellion learned and grew with each new home they built. Every base that fell to the Empire taught lessons that shaped the next sanctuary. Every narrow escape revealed weaknesses to fix, patterns to change, strategies to refine. Over the years, as technology advanced and the Alliance grew stronger, their hidden fortresses evolved from desperate hideouts into sophisticated command centers. The story of these changes is a quiet one, told in small improvements and careful planning. in the patient work of people who knew they were building something that might outlast them. After Yavin 4 fell silent and Hoth was abandoned to the ice, the rebellion grew more cautious about choosing homes. They studied their mistakes with the gentle patience of students who knew their lives depended on the lessons. Yavin had been too obvious once the Empire knew what to look for. Too much of a landmark with that great temple rising above the jungle. Hoth had seemed perfect in its isolation, but isolation meant only one way in and one way out, a trap waiting to close. The rebels needed something different, something that combined the best of both while avoiding their weaknesses. The base on Atallan, shown in the Rebels animated series, represented this new thinking. Instead of one large facility, the rebels spread their presence across multiple locations on the planet's surface. Small outposts connected by secure communications created a network that could function even if one part was destroyed. The coral structures that dotted the landscape provided natural camouflage, making rebel installations blend into the strange geography. Sensors struggled to tell the difference between ships and stone formations. This distributed approach meant attackers couldn't strike a single target and eliminate the entire base. It was slower, less efficient than having everything in one place, but it was safer, and safety had become precious. Technology helped in ways the early rebellion could only dream about. New encryption methods made communications nearly impossible to intercept. Better sensors gave earlier warning of Imperial approach. Improved shield generators, small enough to hide but powerful enough to protect, turned vulnerable outposts into hardened positions. The rebels didn't have the Empire's unlimited resources, but they had something equally valuable. They had brilliant minds working day and night on solutions to impossible problems, and they had the knowledge earned through years of surviving against overwhelming odds. The communications network itself became a kind of invisible base, connecting scattered cells across light years of space. In the early days, rebel groups often worked alone, unaware that others fought the same fight on distant worlds. But as the Alliance matured, they built a web of relay stations and encrypted channels that let information flow freely. A discovery on one world could reach a dozen others within hours. Warnings of Imperial movement spread like ripples across still water. This network had no physical location the Empire could attack, no command center they could destroy. It existed in the spaces between, in the patient relay of signals from station to station, in the dedication of communication officers who kept the channels open no matter what. Some bases evolved in place, growing more sophisticated without moving. The facility on the jungle moon of Yavin 8, different from the famous fourth moon, started as a simple outpost but expanded over time as rebels added new capabilities. Underground bunkers provided protection that surface temples never could. Hangars burrowed deep into bedrock where sensors couldn't penetrate. Living quarters improved from bare caves to actual rooms with doors and privacy. The evolution happened slowly, carefully, each addition planned to avoid detection. Trees were replanted over new construction. Rivers were redirected to cool generators without creating obvious changes in water flow. The rebels became invisible gardeners, tending their hidden bases with the gentle attention of people who understood patience. By the time of the sequel trilogy, decades after the Empire's defeat, the patterns had changed again. The base on D'Qar in The Force Awakens showed what the rebellion, now called the Resistance, had learned from all those years. The facility looked similar to Yavin 4's Great Temple at first glance, another ancient structure repurposed for war. But look closer, and the differences emerged. Better sensor arrays scanned the sky constantly. Hangars had multiple exits. Lessons from Hoth applied. Command centers featured technology that would have seemed like magic to the rebels who planned the first Death Star attack. Yet the core philosophy remained the same. Find forgotten places, adapt them carefully, stay ready to leave at a moment's notice. A John Kloss, the jungle moon that became the final resistance base, reflected all the accumulated wisdom of decades. The rebels built nothing permanent there, nothing that couldn't be abandoned in hours if needed. Ships stayed fueled and ready. Supplies remained packed. The base existed in a state of constant preparation for flight. This wasn't defeatism, but realism. The understanding that survival sometimes meant knowing when to run. The jungle provided cover, the remoteness provided distance from enemies, and the flexibility provided peace of mind. Some believe this return to mobility honored the earliest rebel cells, those small groups who owned nothing but their ships and their determination. Underground bases became increasingly common as sensor technology improved. On various worlds whose names remain classified even now, the rebellion carved entire complexes beneath mountains and deserts. These subterranean sanctuaries offered protection from orbital bombardment and made visual detection nearly impossible. Rebels lived like miners, rarely seeing natural sunlight, working by the glow of artificial lights that tried to mimic day and night cycles. Ventilation systems pulled fresh air from the surface through hidden vents disguised as natural features. Water came from underground springs or collected rainfall. These bases could sustain themselves for months if supply lines were cut. Small, self-contained worlds beneath worlds. Space stations, rare but valuable, represented the ultimate evolution of mobile bases. A few rebel cells managed to capture or construct small stations hidden in nebulae or debris fields. These facilities combined the advantages of planetary bases with the mobility of fleet operations. They could relocate if discovered, could house hundreds of personnel and dozens of ships, could serve as repair facilities and training centers. But they required enormous resources to maintain, constant vigilance to protect, and skilled crews to operate. Only the most established rebel cells could manage such installations, and even then, they lived with the knowledge that one mistake could doom everyone aboard. The evolution of rebel bases tells a softer story than tales of battles and heroes. It speaks of patience, of learning from loss, of the quiet determination to keep trying even when everything seems lost. Each improvement, each lesson applied, each small innovation that made life a little safer or a little more comfortable, these were victories too. And as the bases grew better, more hidden, more resilient, they became symbols of something important. They proved that the rebellion wasn't just fighting to survive, they were building toward a future, preparing for the day when they wouldn't need to hide anymore. Behind every military operation and strategic decision stood people with beating hearts and complicated stories. The leaders of the rebellion weren't born heroes. They grew into their roles through years of hard choices, personal losses, and the gradual understanding that freedom sometimes demands everything you have. Their journeys shaped not just their own lives, but the fate of the entire galaxy, and in their struggles, we see reflections of ourselves, of the courage we hoped we'd find if we ever needed it. Mon Mothma carried the weight of the rebellion on shoulders that seemed too slender for such a burden. Once a senator in the Galactic Republic, she had walked the polished halls of Coruscant, debating policy in chambers where words were the only weapons. She wore flowing robes of white and cream, her hair pulled back in elegant styles that spoke of diplomacy and refinement. But beneath that calm exterior lived a fierce determination that the Empire learned to fear. When Palpatine declared himself Emperor and dissolved the Senate, Mon Mothma faced a choice that would define her life. She could stay silent, keep her privilege and comfort, watch as freedom died. Or she could speak up, knowing that speaking up meant losing everything. She chose rebellion. And that choice transformed her. The transition from politician to revolutionary leader happened slowly, painfully. Mon Mothma had spent her life believing in systems, in the power of words and laws and civilized debate. Now she had to accept that sometimes, when systems fail, people must act outside them. She learned to make decisions that haunted her dreams, signing off on missions that would send brave souls into danger. She sat through strategy sessions where generals discussed acceptable losses, a phrase that never stopped hurting. Yet she carried on with grace that inspired everyone around her. Her quiet strength became the rebellion's backbone, proof that you didn't need to shout or wave weapons to lead a revolution. Sometimes the bravest thing was simply refusing to give up hope. Admiral Akbar brought a different kind of wisdom to the alliance. A Mon Calamari from the ocean world of Mon Cala, he understood war from painful experience. The Empire had enslaved his people, forcing them to build the very star destroyers that would enforce tyranny across the galaxy. Akbar had lived through occupation, had watched his world suffer under imperial cruelty. When he finally escaped and joined the rebellion, he brought not just tactical brilliance, but a deep personal understanding of what they fought against. His orange skin and large eyes marked him as alien to humans, yet his strategic mind earned respect that transcended species. Some believe Akbar represented something crucial about the rebellion, the idea that all beings deserved freedom regardless of how they looked or where they came from. In the Battle of Endor, Akbar commanded the entire rebel fleet from his flagship, the Home One. When he realized the Emperor had laid a trap, when he understood that the Death Star's weapons were operational and his fleet was caught between it and a massive Imperial force, he didn't panic. His famous words, spoken with dawning horror but not despair, have echoed through the years. It's a trap. 3 simple words that became legendary, but behind them was a leader making split-second decisions that would determine whether the rebellion lived or died. He adapted, repositioned, kept his forces fighting even when destruction seemed certain. His calm in chaos saved countless lives. Princess Leia Organa began as royalty and became something far greater. Raised in the peaceful halls of Alderaan's palace, she could have lived a life of comfort and ease. Her adoptive father, Bail Organa, was wealthy and influential. She wanted for nothing material, but she inherited his rebellious spirit, his unwillingness to watch injustice without acting. Even as a teenager, Leia involved herself in relief efforts, helping refugees and speaking against imperial overreach. By the time she was 19, she served as both a senator and a secret rebel operative, living 2 lives with courage that seemed impossible for someone so young. When the Death Star destroyed Alderaan, Leia lost everything in a single moment of unimaginable horror. Her home, her parents, billions of people she'd known and loved, all vaporized to punish her for rebelling. The Empire wanted to break her, to make her an example of what happened when you defied their power. Instead, she became more determined. She channeled her grief into action, her loss into leadership. Over the years, Leia evolved from princess to general, from diplomat to soldier, learning that sometimes peace required fighting for it. Her journey showed that strength came in many forms. She could negotiate treaties and lead commando raids, inspire troops with speeches and comfort the wounded with gentle words. She contained multitudes, and the rebellion needed every part of her. Luke Skywalker arrived at the rebellion by accident, a farm boy swept up in events larger than himself. He'd spent his youth staring at twin suns setting over Tatooine's desert, dreaming of adventure without understanding what adventure actually cost. When his aunt and uncle died, when Obi-Wan Kenobi revealed the truth about his father, Luke stepped into a story that had been waiting for him. But he wasn't the confident hero people sometimes remember. He was uncertain, impulsive, often wrong. He nearly got himself killed in the Death Star's trash compactor. He rushed off to face Vader before he was ready, losing his hand and nearly his life. He struggled with anger and fear and the temptation of the dark side. Yet Luke's journey mattered precisely because it was so human. He made mistakes and learned from them. He failed and got back up. His power came not from being perfect, but from keeping his compassion even when compassion seemed foolish. When he faced the Emperor, when Palpatine wanted him to kill his own father and embrace hatred, Luke chose differently. He threw away his weapon and declared himself a Jedi, knowing it might mean his death. That choice, that refusal to win through darkness, inspired Vader's redemption and the Empire's defeat. Luke proved that the rebellion wasn't just about military victory. It was about being better than your enemies, about holding on to your soul even when letting go would be easier. Han Solo never intended to be a hero at all. A smuggler and scoundrel, he lived for himself and his Wookiee friend Chewbacca. When he agreed to rescue Princess Leia, he did it for money. When he helped destroy the Death Star, he claimed he was just settling debts. But slowly, almost against his will, Han discovered he cared. About Leia, about Luke, about the cause they fought for. His transformation from selfish smuggler to committed rebel showed that anyone could change, that heroism wasn't about where you started, but about who you chose to become. By Return of the Jedi, Han was leading commando teams and making sacrifices without expecting anything in return. He'd found something more valuable than credits. He'd found purpose and family and the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for. These leaders, each so different, created something beautiful together. Mon Mothma's diplomacy, Akbar's strategy, Leia's determination, Luke's compassion, Han's loyalty, all woven together into a tapestry stronger than any single thread. Their personal journeys became the rebellion's journey, their growth reflected in the Alliance's evolution from desperate fugitives to liberators of the galaxy. And in the quiet moments between battles, when they gathered to plan or simply to remember those they'd lost, they carried something precious. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that together they could face anything, that love and friendship might be the greatest weapons of all. The great leaders stood at the front of every story, but behind them stretched an endless line of people whose names most would never know. These unsung heroes kept the rebellion alive in ways that rarely made history books. They flew missions that never got medals. They gathered intelligence that saved thousands but remained classified. They fixed ships and ran supplies and stood watch through long, lonely nights. Without them, there would have been no rebellion at all, just a handful of leaders with no one to lead. Wedge Antilles flew more dangerous missions than almost anyone in the Alliance, yet he remained quietly in the background while others received the glory. A pilot of extraordinary skill, he survived both Death Star attacks, threading his X-Wing through impossible spaces while explosions bloomed around him. At the Battle of Yavin, he flew as Red 2, staying on target even when TIE fighters screamed past his cockpit. At the Battle of Endor, he helped destroy the second Death Star's reactor core, navigating corridors so narrow his wing-tips nearly scraped the walls. Between these famous battles, he flew countless others that history forgot, escort missions and reconnaissance runs and desperate fights against overwhelming odds. Some believe Wedge represented the true heart of the rebellion, the professional soldier who kept showing up day after day without asking for recognition. He never sought command, never demanded attention, just did his job with quiet excellence. Other pilots looked to him for guidance because they knew he'd been through everything they feared and come out alive. He taught new recruits tricks that might save their lives. He mourned friends lost in battle, then climbed back into his cockpit because the war wasn't over. His steady presence reminded everyone that heroism didn't require destiny or special powers. Sometimes it just required showing up and doing what needed doing, again and again, until the job was finished. Gold Squadron and Red Squadron filled their ranks with pilots whose stories deserved their own legends. Biggs Darklighter had been Luke's childhood friend on Tatooine, dreaming with him of escaping desert boredom. He joined the Imperial Academy, then defected to the rebellion when he saw what the Empire truly was. At Yavin, he flew alongside his old friend one last time before a TIE fighter's blast ended his story. Jek Porkins, heavy-set and jovial, brought humor to tense briefings and died trying to complete his attack run, even as his ship malfunctioned around him. Dak Ralter, young and eager on Hoth, had just enough time to tell Luke he felt like he could take on the whole Empire before an Imperial Walker's blast silenced him forever. Each pilot had a life before the rebellion, dreams and families and reasons for fighting. They came from farming worlds and industrial planets, from wealthy families and poverty, from dozens of species across the galaxy. What united them was the choice they'd made, the decision that this cause mattered more than safety. In the expanded stories, we learn their names and histories. We discover that the pilot in the background of that briefing scene had survived 3 previous battles, that the gunner manning the ion cannon on Hoth had a daughter in the medical bay, that the technician prepping ships in the hangar had lost her entire family to Imperial violence. These details, quietly tucked into reference books and fan guides, remind us that every uniform contained a person. The intelligence operatives worked in shadows even darker than the void of space. Cassian Andor, whose story we know from Rogue One and his own series, represented countless others who did terrible things in service of a better future. Rebel intelligence officers gathered information through means that rarely appeared in inspiring speeches. They bribed Imperial officials and hacked secure networks. They posed as loyal citizens while secretly recording troop movements. Sometimes they had to make choices that kept them awake at night, eliminating threats before those threats could destroy entire cells. The moral weight of this work crushed some people. Others, like Cassian, carried it because someone had to, because intelligence won wars as surely as ships and soldiers. These operatives rarely saw the results of their work. They'd spend months cultivating a source, risking exposure every day, to learn one piece of information that might save a base they'd never visit. They lived knowing that if they were caught, the rebellion would deny knowing them, would let them face Imperial justice alone to protect the larger network. Yet they continued, driven by the belief that their sacrifice meant something. In quiet safe houses on Imperial worlds, in the cargo holds of smuggler ships, in cantinas where they pretended to be drunk while actually memorizing conversations, these shadows gathered the knowledge that kept the rebellion one step ahead of annihilation. Droids served the rebellion in ways organic beings couldn't. C-3PO and R2-D2 became famous alongside their human companions, but thousands of other droids performed equally vital functions. Astromech droids like R2 units calculated hyperspace jumps and repaired ships mid-flight, their cheerful beeps hiding sophisticated computers. Protocol droids translated between the dozens of languages spoken across the Alliance. Medical droids assisted in surgeries, their steady hands never trembling with fear or exhaustion. Maintenance droids kept bases running, repairing systems day and night without complaint. Some rebels forgot these droids were thinking beings, treating them as tools. Others, raised in cultures that respected artificial intelligence, knew better and formed friendships with their mechanical companions. Chopper, the ornery astromech from the Rebel series, showed that droids could be as stubborn and brave as any organic rebel. Painted in orange and white, battered from years of service, he saved his crew countless times through equal parts skill and creative rule-breaking. He'd shock enemies, hack Imperial computers, and complain in grumpy electronic warbles about having to do everything himself. Yet when his family faced danger, he'd roll into harm's way without hesitation. His loyalty ran deeper than his programming, suggesting that perhaps consciousness and courage weren't limited to flesh and blood. The rebellion welcomed species that the Empire considered inferior or dangerous. Bothans, known for their intelligence networks, provided crucial information about the second Death Star at terrible cost. Many Bothans died to bring the rebellion those plans, a sacrifice mentioned in Return of the Jedi that represented entire families and communities committed to the cause. Mon Calamari brought their shipbuilding expertise and their world's resources after liberating themselves from Imperial slavery. Sullustan pilots, with their natural navigation abilities, flew escort missions through asteroid fields and nebulae where human pilots would get lost. Each species brought unique perspectives and abilities, enriching the alliance with diversity that made it stronger. The Empire's xenophobia became its weakness, blinding it to the talents of non-human beings. The rebellion's inclusiveness became its strength, creating a military force that could adapt to any environment and solve problems from multiple angles. In briefing rooms and mess halls, dozens of languages mingled, different customs blended, and beings who might have been strangers on their home worlds became family through shared purpose. Behind every successful mission stood technicians and mechanics who kept equipment functioning against impossible odds. They worked with aging ships and salvaged parts, performing miracles of repair with limited resources. They'd modify X-wings to squeeze out more speed, reinforce hull plating with whatever materials they could find, and keep sensors working even when the components were 3 generations obsolete. These technicians rarely flew into battle, but their work determined who came home alive. A properly maintained hyperdrive meant escaping Imperial pursuers. A carefully calibrated targeting computer meant the difference between a hit and a miss. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine all these people working together across the galaxy. The pilot checking her X-wing before dawn. The intelligence officer sending an encrypted message from an Imperial city. The mechanic welding a hull breach by the light of a single work lamp. The droid calculating jump coordinates while its pilot sleeps. Each one a small light in the darkness, and together, bright enough to illuminate the path to freedom. The rebellion was more than ships and soldiers, more than bases and battles. At its heart lived an idea, a belief about what the galaxy could be and what people deserved. This philosophy guided every decision, every sacrifice, every moment when rebels had to choose between the easy path and the right one. Understanding what the rebellion truly stood for helps us see why it mattered so much, why people gave everything they had for a cause that seemed impossible. The Alliance to Restore the Republic chose its name carefully. Every word carried meaning. They weren't just fighting against the Empire. They were fighting for something older and better, a democratic system where beings had voices and choices and rights. The old Republic had lasted for thousands of years before Palpatine twisted it into his empire. It had problems, certainly, corruption and bureaucracy and inequality. But it had also protected freedoms that the Empire crushed overnight. The rebellion looked backward to move forward, seeking to restore what was lost while learning from past mistakes. The Alliance Charter, a document created when scattered resistance groups first united, laid out principles that would guide the movement. Freedom of speech, so beings could speak truth without fear. Freedom of movement, so people could travel between worlds without checkpoints and suspicion. The right to fair trial, so justice meant more than an imperial officer's whim. Protection for all species, not just humans who the Empire favored. These weren't abstract ideas. They were specific promises about the kind of galaxy rebels wanted to create. When pilots climbed into cockpits knowing they might not return, they carried these promises with them, tangible as any weapon. Democratic values shaped how the rebellion itself operated. Unlike the Empire's rigid hierarchy, where one person commanded absolute obedience, the Alliance made decisions through councils and votes. Mon Mothma led, but she couldn't simply order military action. She had to convince other leaders, had to build consensus, had to respect that others might see things differently. This process was slower than imperial decree, frustrating when speed seemed vital, but it meant the rebellion practiced what it preached. They were building democracy by being democratic, even when facing an enemy who could act with brutal efficiency. Yet democracy in wartime created difficult questions that troubled rebel leaders during long, sleepless nights. How far could they go while remaining better than their enemy? When was violence justified, and when did it become just another form of tyranny? These weren't easy questions with simple answers. In the Andor series, we saw rebels debate these moral lines. Some argued that fighting the Empire required matching their ruthlessness, that you couldn't win a war by following rules the enemy ignored. Others insisted that becoming like the Empire would make victory meaningless, that the means mattered as much as the end. Different rebel cells interpreted the cause through their own cultural understanding, creating a philosophy that was both unified and wonderfully diverse. On some worlds, rebels focused on protecting their communities, seeing the cause as deeply personal. On others, they thought about galactic justice, about systems and laws and government. Some cells drew on religious traditions that taught about light overcoming darkness. Others approached resistance as a practical necessity, fighting simply because tyranny made life unbearable. All these perspectives wove together, creating a movement richer than any single viewpoint could provide. The starboard insignia that marked rebel uniforms and ships carried layers of meaning. The simple phoenix design, rising with wings spread, represented hope and renewal. Like the mythical bird that died in flames only to be reborn, the rebellion would rise from the Republic's ashes. The orange and red colors spoke of fire and passion, of warmth in the cold void. Wearing that symbol meant declaring yourself, marking yourself as someone who'd chosen a side. It was dangerous, making you a target for imperial reprisal. But it was also powerful, letting others know they weren't alone, that resistance lived and breathed and refused to surrender. Maintaining moral high ground while fighting a desperate war required constant vigilance. The Empire made it easy to hate them with their planet-destroying weapons and casual cruelty. But hate was dangerous, could twist you into something you didn't want to become. Rebel leaders worked to channel anger into determination rather than vengeance. They tried to remember that even stormtroopers were people, conscripts or recruits, who might not have chosen their path freely. This compassion didn't mean weakness. Rebels still fought fiercely, still destroyed Imperial facilities and ships, but they tried to do so without celebrating death, without losing sight of why they fought in the first place. Some believe the rebellion's greatest strength was this very tension between idealism and pragmatism. They held tight to principles while recognizing that perfect purity was impossible in wartime. They made compromises, but tried not to compromise too much. They acknowledged their own failures while working to do better. This honest struggle with difficult questions made them more human, more real, than the Empire's certainty about its own righteousness. The Empire never questioned itself. The rebellion questioned constantly, and that questioning kept them grounded in values worth defending. The balance between hope and realism defined rebel philosophy in practical terms. Hope alone wouldn't defeat star destroyers or free enslaved worlds. But without hope, why bother fighting at all? Rebels had to believe victory was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. They had to plan carefully while maintaining faith that plans would succeed despite terrible odds. This dual awareness, holding both hope and clear-eyed assessment of reality, required strength that didn't come from muscles or weapons. It came from something deeper, a refusal to let despair make decisions for you. The symbolic importance of small victories couldn't be overstated. Every imperial convoy destroyed, every prisoner freed, every recruitment drive that brought new volunteers, these moments mattered beyond their tactical value. They proved the empire wasn't invincible. They showed frightened populations that resistance was possible. They gave rebels themselves reason to keep going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. The rebellion understood that symbols had power, that stories of courage inspired more courage, that winning hearts sometimes mattered as much as winning battles. As the war dragged on year after year, the philosophy evolved without losing its core. Early rebels had been idealists and dreamers, believers in grand causes. Later rebels, tempered by loss and hardship, became more practical without becoming cynical. They'd seen what the fight cost, had buried too many friends, had made choices that haunted them. Yet they continued, not because they were naive about the price, but because they'd decided the price was worth paying. This mature commitment, clear-eyed and determined, represented the rebellion at its strongest. In quiet moments between crises, rebels discussed what would come after victory. Not everyone agreed on details. Some wanted to recreate the old republic exactly as it had been. Others argued for something new that kept the good while discarding the corrupt. These debates were healthy, showing that the rebellion embraced multiple visions of the future. What united them was the belief that whoever inherited the galaxy deserved to shape it themselves through free choice rather than imposed rule. The rebellion fought for the right of beings to determine their own destiny, even if those beings might choose paths the rebels themselves wouldn't prefer. The philosophy that drove the rebellion wasn't complicated or sophisticated. It was as simple as believing that people deserved freedom, that might didn't make right, that standing together could accomplish what seemed impossible alone. These basic truths, worn smooth by repetition but never losing their power, sustained countless beings through the darkest hours. And as you rest now, let those simple truths bring comfort. That good is worth fighting for. That hope matters. That together, ordinary people can change the galaxy. The story of the rebellion works on many levels at once, like music that sounds simple on the surface but reveals hidden harmonies the more you listen. George Lucas knew this when he created Star Wars, drawing from storytelling traditions that stretched back thousands of years. He wanted to craft something that felt ancient and new at the same time, that spoke to people in ways they might not even consciously recognize. The result was a narrative that functioned as adventure, as myth, and as something deeper that touched the human soul. Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey influenced Lucas profoundly as he shaped his saga. Campbell studied myths from cultures around the world and found patterns that repeated across time and space. The hero who leaves home, the mentor who provides guidance, the journey into darkness, the supreme ordeal, the return transformed. Lucas took these ancient patterns and dressed them in spaceships and lightsabers, creating a modern myth that felt as timeless as the oldest stories told around fires. The rebellion fit perfectly into this framework, representing the community that supports the hero, the people worth saving, the reason the journey matters at all. Luke's journey from farm to Jedi followed Campbell's pattern so closely that film students still study it today. But the rebellion itself underwent a parallel journey, transforming from scattered resistance into unified alliance. In the beginning, they were separate and weak, hiding in shadows. They received guidance from leaders like Mon Mothma, mentors in their own right. They descended into their darkest moment on Hoth, scattered and broken. They emerged stronger, gathering for the supreme ordeal at Endor. And finally, they returned transformed, not as rebels anymore, but as restorers of peace. This larger pattern gave the story a satisfying shape that audiences felt even if they couldn't name it. Some viewers see the saga as commentary on power and how it corrupts or liberates. The Empire represents authoritarian control, where one voice decides everything and all others must obey or be crushed. Every imperial scene shows this rigid hierarchy, officers standing at attention.
Troops moving in perfect formation, no room for individual thought or choice. The rebellion offers the opposite vision, messy and chaotic and alive. Pilots argue with commanders. Different species bring different perspectives. Decisions emerge from discussion rather than decree. This contrast suggests that freedom, despite its inefficiencies, creates something more human and ultimately stronger than tyranny's cold order. Others interpret the story through historical lenses, seeing reflections of real conflicts in this fictional war. Lucas himself acknowledged that the Vietnam War influenced his thinking, particularly the image of a powerful military machine fighting guerrilla forces in jungle terrain. The rebellion's tactics, hitting hard and disappearing, using knowledge of local terrain, winning hearts and minds while the Empire relied on fear, these mirrored strategies used by resistance movements throughout history. Yavin Four's jungle base could be Vietnam. Hoth's desperate evacuation echoed Dunkirk. Endor's forest battle recalled countless partisan operations in occupied territories. The story became a way to explore these difficult subjects at safe distance, to examine what resistance means without triggering defensive reactions about specific wars. Yet Lucas layered his references carefully, never pointing directly at one conflict or ideology. The story could speak to anyone who'd experienced oppression or dreamed of freedom. People living under authoritarian regimes saw their own struggles reflected. Those who'd never faced tyranny could imagine what courage it would require. The universality made the story powerful. Let it transcend its specific creation moment to speak across decades and cultures. A child in the 70s and a child today both understand the rebellion's appeal, even though they're processing it through completely different life experiences. The myth-making extended to how stories were told within the story itself. Rebels shared tales of victories and heroes, creating legends that inspired others to join. Luke Skywalker's destruction of the Death Star became a story told and retold, growing slightly more heroic with each telling. Some believe this mirrored how real resistance movements sustain themselves, through narratives that give meaning to suffering and hope to the desperate. The rebellion wasn't just fighting a military war. They were fighting a narrative war, creating stories of courage to counter the Empire's stories of inevitable victory. Different directors bringing their visions to rebel stories added new layers of meaning. Irvin Kershner made Empire Strikes Back darker and more complex, showing that heroic journeys include failure and loss. Richard Marquand gave Return of the Jedi a mythic quality, with Ewoks representing nature rising against technology. Gareth Edwards crafted Rogue One as a war film, gritty and grounded, showing the unglamorous reality of sacrifice. Tony Gilroy made Andor a political thriller, exploring how ordinary people radicalize when systems fail them. Each interpretation enriched the whole, proving the rebellion could be understood through multiple lenses without losing coherence. Gentle theories emerge when we look closely at symbolic choices throughout the saga. Why did the rebellion need both soldiers and politicians? Some suggest this represented the understanding that military victory alone wouldn't create lasting peace, that you needed people skilled at building systems, not just destroying them. Mon Mothma couldn't fly an X-Wing, but she could negotiate treaties and craft legislation.
Wedge Antilles could destroy a Death Star, but probably couldn't run a government. The rebellion's structure mirrored democratic ideals by giving both voices power, by recognizing that different skills served the cause in different ways. The decision to show the rebellion as genuinely diverse, not just in species but in approach and philosophy, carried meaning that went beyond representation. It suggested that monocultures, like the Empire's human-dominated hierarchy, were inherently weaker than diverse coalitions. Different perspectives spotted problems, singular viewpoints missed. Different abilities complemented each other. Different cultural traditions offered varied solutions to the same challenges. The rebellion's diversity wasn't window dressing. It was their secret weapon, making them adaptable where the Empire was rigid, creative where their enemy was predictable. The narrative choice to balance massive space battles with intimate character moments created rhythm that made the saga breathable. After the intensity of combat, we'd get quiet scenes of characters talking, processing, connecting. These moments weren't filler. They were essential, showing what the fighting was for, reminding us that war affected real people with feelings and relationships. The rebellion fought for the right to have these quiet moments, to love and laugh and simply exist without fear. The peaceful scenes gave weight to the action, made us care about outcomes beyond just tactical victory. Some interpretations suggest the rebellion represented hope not just for the galaxy, but for audiences themselves. When Star Wars arrived in the 70s, many people felt overwhelmed by problems that seemed too big to solve. The rebellion offered a different message, that small groups could challenge massive institutions, that ordinary people contained extraordinary courage, that persistence mattered more than power. This message resonated then and resonates now, speaking to the part of us that wants to believe we could make a difference if circumstances demanded it. The storytelling choices around the rebellion reveal a deep understanding of what makes narratives satisfying. The underdog structure gave audiences someone to root for. The clear moral stakes made investment easy. The diversity of characters meant different viewers could find different entry points. The balance of victory and loss kept tension alive while maintaining hope. These weren't accidents, but careful craft. Lucas and later creators understanding that stories this big needed strong foundations. As you drift further into rest, consider how the rebellion's story has lived in your own imagination, the way it made you feel the first time you saw it, the comfort it brought during difficult periods, the inspiration it offered when you needed courage. Stories have power beyond entertainment, and the best ones, like this tale of brave rebels challenging darkness, become part of how we understand ourselves and our world. Music and sound wrapped around the rebellion like a warm blanket, shaping how we felt about these brave fighters before we even consciously understood what we were feeling. John Williams created a sonic landscape that made the heart soar and the spirit lift, composing themes that have lived in our minds for decades. Close your eyes now and you can probably hear them, those familiar melodies that mean hope and adventure and the courage to stand against darkness. The music told its own story, parallel to the images on screen, sometimes even more powerful than the visuals themselves. The main theme, that triumphant fanfare that opens every Star Wars film, became inseparable from the rebellion's spirit. Those bold brass notes announced that something important was about to happen, that heroes were rising to meet their moment. Williams drew inspiration from classical composers like Gustav Holst and Richard Wagner, creating music that felt epic and timeless. The theme swells and builds, strings joining brass, percussion adding drive, until you feel lifted out of your seat. When rebel ships appeared on screen accompanied by this music, we didn't need dialogue to understand. These were the good ones, the ones worth cheering for. But Williams didn't rely on volume and grandeur alone. He understood that rebellion needed quieter moments, too, softer themes that spoke of hope rather than triumph. The Princess Leia theme, gentle and lyrical, featured strings that seemed to sing rather than play. When this melody appeared, often during planning scenes or moments of reflection, it reminded us what the fighting was for. Not glory or conquest, but the chance to live peacefully, to love, to simply exist without fear. The theme moved through major and minor keys, suggesting both strength and vulnerability, perfectly capturing Leia herself and the cause she represented. The Rebel briefing room carried its own soundscape that made those scenes feel real and lived in. If you listen carefully during the Yavin 4 briefing before the Death Star attack, you hear layers of ambient sound beneath the dialogue. Computer terminals beep and chirp, processing data. Distant conversations murmur as technicians work. The hum of power generators provides a constant low frequency that you feel more than hear. These sounds weren't accidental. Sound designer Ben Burtt crafted each one carefully, understanding that silence felt wrong in a military base. The ambient noise created a sense of activity and urgency, of a facility alive with purpose. X-Wing engines sang with a particular scream that became iconic, a sound that meant hope was arriving. Burt created this by combining jet aircraft recordings with other mechanical sounds, then processing them until they felt futuristic yet familiar. Each Rebel ship had its own acoustic signature. Y-wings rumbled with deeper, older engines. A-wings shrieked with high-pitched speed. The Millennium Falcon's engines had a regular quality, suggesting a ship held together through luck and constant repair. These distinct sounds let audiences know what was happening even when they couldn't see the screen, created an audio vocabulary that enriched every space battle. The alarm klaxons on Hoth Base pierced through the cold air with urgent warning, a sound designed to jolt people into action without causing panic. When sensors detected the Imperial probe droid when the invasion began, these alarms told us immediately that safety had ended. The sound mixed mechanical sirens with electronic tones, creating something that felt military and functional. Throughout the evacuation, we heard these alarms mixing with explosions, shouted orders, the whine of ship engines warming up. The soundscape told the story of organized chaos, of people trying to execute emergency plans while death approached. Williams composed specific themes for specific moments that defined the rebellion's journey. The Battle of Yavin featured music that built tension slowly as pilots entered the trench, then exploded into celebration when Luke's torpedoes found their mark. The Hoth evacuation played under music that combined action with melancholy, acknowledging that survival sometimes meant leaving home behind. The Battle of Endor wove together multiple themes as the story's threads came together. Rebel fanfares mixing with the Emperor's sinister motifs and Luke's hero theme, creating a tapestry of sound that matched the visual complexity. Some believe the music carried meaning that went beyond mere accompaniment. The choice to use a full orchestra rather than electronic instruments suggested something important about the rebellion itself. Orchestras require many musicians working together, each contributing their unique voice to create something larger than any individual could produce alone. This mirrored the rebellion's structure perfectly, diverse beings combining their strengths into unified purpose. The Empire, meanwhile, often had mechanical, processed sounds, suggesting their cold efficiency and lack of humanity. The quieter musical moments deserve attention too. Those soft passages that appeared during character scenes and reflections. When Luke watched the twin suns set on Tatooine, the Force theme played gently, almost questioning, suggesting potential not yet realized. When the rebels mourned their losses, when lovers separated, When heroes faced impossible choices, the music supported without overwhelming. Williams understood that sometimes the most powerful moments needed space to breathe, needed music that enhanced emotion without dictating it. Ben Burtt's sound design extended to the smallest details, creating a complete audio environment that made the galaxy feel real. The clicks and whirs of droids communicating, the snap hiss of lightsabers igniting, the particular quality of doors opening on rebel ships versus Imperial vessels. Burt visited junkyards and recording studios, manipulating everyday sounds until they became alien yet comprehensible. He understood that sound design worked best when audiences didn't consciously notice it, when the audio felt so natural that you accepted it without question. The communications chatter that played in background during battles added another layer of immersion. Pilots called out targets and warnings to each other, their voices filtered through radio static. Ground controllers coordinated movements. We rarely understood every word, but the presence of these voices made the battles feel populated, reminded us that dozens or hundreds of people were participating in every engagement. These background voices represented all those unnamed rebels, the ones whose stories we'd never know but whose contributions mattered just as much. Music and sound worked together during key moments to create emotional peaks that stayed with audiences long after leaving theaters. The moment when the rebel fleet arrived at Endor, ships dropping out of hyperspace to that triumphant fanfare. The silence after Han was frozen in carbonite, absence of sound speaking louder than any music could. The building intensity as Luke made his trench run, Williams's score matching the mounting tension beat for beat. These moments worked because audio and visual reinforced each other perfectly, creating experiences that were greater than the sum of their parts. As you settle deeper now, let the memory of these sounds wash over you gently. The soft beeping of R2-D2 almost like a lullaby, the distant hum of a rebel base at rest, the gentle theme that plays when heroes find a moment of peace. These sounds have become part of our internal landscape, comfort and inspiration woven together in melody and tone. The rebellion had many weapons, but perhaps none more powerful than the music that made us believe in them, that lifted our spirits and told us that hope, like a beautiful song, could never truly be silenced. The rebellion's influence spread far beyond the movie screen, rippling out into the real world in ways George Lucas never anticipated. The story of brave fighters challenging an overwhelming empire resonated with people across cultures and generations, becoming more than entertainment. It became a symbol, a rallying cry, a way for people to express their own hopes for justice and freedom. The Starbird insignia began appearing in places that had nothing to do with science fiction, carried by those who saw their own struggles reflected in that galaxy far, far away. Around the world, protesters and activists adopted rebel symbols to represent their causes. The Starbird appeared spray-painted on walls in different cities, held on signs at demonstrations, worn as patches on jackets by people fighting for various freedoms. During protests in different countries over the years, people held up images of the Alliance symbol, understanding without explanation what it meant. Resistance, hope, the belief that ordinary people could challenge powerful systems. The symbol transcended language barriers and cultural differences, communicating something universal about the human desire for dignity and self-determination. Different generations connected with the rebellion through their own historical lenses, finding relevance in different aspects of the story. Those who grew up with the original trilogy in the late 70s and early 80s often saw echoes of the Cold War, of living under the shadow of nuclear powers and wondering if small voices mattered against such massive forces. The rebellion showed them that determination could outlast military might, that the side with more weapons didn't automatically win. This message offered comfort during uncertain times. suggested that the future wasn't predetermined by whoever held the biggest guns. Children of the 90s and 2000s found new meanings in the same story. They watched the prequels and saw how democracies could slip into authoritarianism, how fear could be weaponized, how good people could stand by while evil took control. The rebellion represented what happened when some refused to stand by, when a few brave souls said no even when everyone else stayed silent. For young people growing up in an increasingly complex world, watching news of conflicts and injustices they felt powerless to affect, the rebellion offered a different narrative. Change was possible. Resistance mattered. Your voice counted even when it felt small. More recent audiences, encountering Star Wars through sequel trilogy and modern series, brought their own contemporary concerns to the viewing. They noticed how the story addressed themes of environmental destruction, refugee crises, the danger of forgetting history. The resistance in the sequels faced a galaxy that had become complacent, that assumed freedom would sustain itself without effort. This resonated with viewers watching real-world democratic backsliding, seeing hard-won rights challenged, wondering if their generation would have to fight battles their grandparents thought they'd already won. The rebellion's persistence across generations suggested that the fight for freedom never truly ends, just transforms into new shapes. Fan communities kept the rebellion alive during the years between films and shows. Online forums buzzed with discussions about tactics and philosophy. Fan fiction explored the stories of background characters, giving names and histories to pilots who'd appeared for seconds on screen. Artists drew rebel propaganda posters in vintage styles, imagining what recruitment materials might have looked like. These creative works weren't just hobbies. They were ways of engaging with ideas that mattered, of exploring through fiction what courage and resistance meant in practical terms. Some gentle theories emerged from dedicated fans who studied every frame, looking for deeper connections and hidden meanings. A popular interpretation suggests that the rebellion's structure deliberately mirrors historical resistance movements more specifically than generally acknowledged. The cell-based organization matches how French resistance operated during World War II. The mix of military action and political maneuvering reflects how successful revolutions typically unfold. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and propaganda echoes actual guerrilla warfare doctrine. Whether Lucas intended these specific parallels, or they emerged naturally from research into resistance movements, fans found them meaningful, saw them as evidence that the story took real-world struggles seriously. Other theories focus on symbolic elements, finding encoded messages in design choices. The rebellion's orange and white color scheme, warm and visible, contrasts with the Empire's cold grays and blacks. Some believe this represents the philosophical difference between the two sides. Orange is the color of fire and sunset, of warmth and life. The Empire's colors are the colors of metal and ash, of lifelessness and uniformity. The rebellion announced itself loudly, while the Empire tried to blend everything into one neutral shade. Even in visual design, the story communicated which side celebrated life and which tried to control it. The expanded universe materials, including books and comics and games, kept the rebellion's story growing between major releases. Novels explored the formation of the Alliance, showing how scattered cells finally united. Comic books told the stories of specific missions, giving readers front-row seats to adventures that films never had time to show. Video games let players experience being rebel pilots or soldiers, creating personal connections to the cause. Each medium added layers, building a mythology so rich that devoted fans could spend lifetimes exploring it without exhausting the material. Cosplay communities embraced the rebellion with particular enthusiasm, crafting detailed costumes and gathering at conventions to celebrate these characters together.
Building a rebel flight suite or Leia's white gown wasn't just about looking like a character. It was about embodying the qualities those characters represented. When someone put on rebel orange, they were choosing to identify with courage and resistance. When groups of cosplayers gathered, all wearing different rebel outfits from different eras and different corners of the galaxy, they created a living representation of the Alliance's diversity and unity. They proved that the rebellion lived on, not just in media but in hearts. The generational passage of Star Wars created beautiful moments of connection between parents and children. Adults who'd grown up with the original trilogy introduced it to their kids, experiencing it fresh through young eyes while remembering their own first viewing. Grandparents shared the saga with grandchildren, creating bonds across decades through shared story. In these moments of transmission, the rebellion's message passed from generation to generation naturally, effortlessly. The story became more than entertainment. It became tradition, something families owned together, a common language of hope and heroism. Some believe the enduring appeal of the rebellion comes from its fundamental optimism. In a world that often feels dark and complicated, where problems seem too large and solutions too distant, the rebellion offers something precious. The promise that regular people matter, that standing up makes a difference. That hope isn't foolish but necessary. That working together, we can accomplish what seems impossible alone. These aren't naive messages, but vital ones, antidotes to despair and cynicism. The rebellion suggests that believing in better futures helps create them, that maintaining hope is itself an act of resistance against forces that want us to give up. The cultural legacy extends into unexpected places. Teachers use Star Wars to discuss ethics and philosophy with students. Therapists find that discussing characters and their choices helps clients explore their own struggles. Military academies analyze the tactics and strategy. The rebellion became a touchstone, a shared reference point in a fragmented culture. One of the few stories that most people know regardless of their background. This universality gives it power beyond entertainment, makes it useful for communication and connection. As you rest now, surrounded by the softness of night, know that you're part of this legacy too. Every person who found inspiration in the rebellion, who felt their courage strengthen watching those X-wings fly, who chose to believe that hope mattered even when evidence suggested otherwise. The story continues not just in new movies and shows, but in the real world, wherever people choose resistance over resignation, wherever ordinary beings decide to stand for something larger than themselves. The rebellion endures because its message is timeless, and that message whispers gently now as you drift toward sleep. You're not powerless. You're not alone. Together, we are stronger than any darkness. Behind every scene we watched, behind every frame that flickered past, lay countless small details that most viewers never noticed, but that made the galaxy feel complete and alive. The people who created Star Wars cared deeply about these hidden elements, adding layers of story and meaning that rewarded close attention. As we drift toward rest now, let us explore these gentle secrets, these whispered tales of care and craft that made the rebellion feel like something you could reach out and touch. On Echo Base, if you look carefully during the evacuation scenes, you can spot rebel technicians whose faces returned in different scenes, wearing different uniforms. The production team created names and backstories for many of these background characters, writing them in reference guides that dedicated fans treasured. There was Torin Farr, the woman coordinating the evacuation over the loudspeakers, her voice steady even as the base crumbled around her. There was Corporal Kevin Ott, operating a sensor station, monitoring Imperial approach until the last possible moment. These weren't just extras filling space. They were characters someone had imagined fully, had given histories and motivations, even though their stories would never make it to screen.
Some of the X-Wing and Y-Wing models that appeared in the original trilogy survived all 3 films, flying mission after mission in different paint schemes. Model makers grew attached to specific miniatures, gave them nicknames, mourned when one was destroyed during filming for an explosion scene. A particular X-Wing that flew in the trench at Yavin returned for Hoth and appeared again at Endor, its tiny hull bearing 3 films' worth of careful detail. The people who built and filmed these models understood they were creating more than props. They were birthing a fleet, and each ship deserved individual care and attention. Costume pieces served multiple purposes across the trilogy, transformed and repurposed as budgets demanded creativity. A vest worn by one rebel pilot in A New Hope might appear on a different character in Empire, slightly modified, given new life. The costume department maintained detailed records of every piece, tracking which actors wore what and when, ensuring continuity while maximizing limited resources. This recycling wasn't corner-cutting, but practical magic, the same kind of making do that the fictional rebellion practiced. Art mirrored life as filmmakers stretched resources to create a galaxy.
Deleted scenes held stories that shaped the saga, even though they never appeared in final cuts. In one removed sequence from A New Hope, Luke met Biggs at Tosha Station before leaving Tatooine, establishing their friendship through conversation rather than just the brief moment before battle. Though cut for pacing, this scene influenced how the actors played their reunion at Yavin, added weight to Biggs's death that some viewers felt even without seeing the setup. The ghost of the deleted scene haunted what remained, invisible but present. Some fans believe certain background details hint at larger stories the films never had time to explore. In the Rebel hangar scenes, you can spot equipment marked with symbols and writing that suggest complex supply chains and manufacturing networks. Where did the rebellion get all those uniforms? Who made the helmets? The presence of these items, consistent across bases and time periods, suggests infrastructure and planning that the movies couldn't show. A thoughtful interpretation sees this as evidence that the rebellion was larger and more organized than the desperate improvisation we usually saw, that behind the dramatic missions existed boring but essential work of logistics and administration. The background conversations in the cantina and other crowded scenes featured aliens speaking constructed languages that sound designers created with full grammar rules and vocabulary. Most viewers would never know these languages had structure, would hear only exotic sounds. But the actors performing these roles often knew what their characters were saying, could translate if asked. This attention to detail that no one would notice made the performances more genuine, gave the galaxy linguistic depth that viewers sensed even without understanding. Reference books and technical manuals expanded on ships and equipment seen briefly on screen. The Y-Wing fighter that looked old and battered in the films had a full history in supplementary materials. It had been a frontline bomber during the Clone Wars, decades old by the time of the rebellion, kept flying through constant maintenance and desperate modification. The exposed engines weren't a design choice, but the result of removing heavy armor plating to improve speed, a practical decision that created the iconic look. These stories existed for people who wanted them, who needed to understand not just what things were, but why they were that way. Production challenges became creative opportunities that shaped iconic moments. The decision to film the Battle of Yavin Trench Run, using models on tracks, with cameras mounted to follow them, came from budget limitations. More expensive techniques existed, but the production couldn't afford them. Yet the solution they developed created a visceral sense of speed and danger that fancier methods might not have achieved. The camera shakes and moves with the ships, putting viewers in the cockpit in a way that feels immediate and real. Limitation birthed innovation, and innovation created magic. Some believe the most telling details are the smallest ones,
The touches no director ordered, but crew members added from love of the project. A model maker might add an extra tiny antenna to an X-Wing's hull. A costume designer might weather a flight suit more than strictly necessary, adding a patch or stain that told a microstory. An actor might deliver a line with a particular inflection that suggested history between characters never explained on screen. These moments of individual creativity, multiplied across hundreds of people working on the films, created texture and depth that no single vision could achieve alone. The enduring appeal of the Rebellion comes partly from this richness, this sense that the galaxy extends beyond the frame, that every character has a story, that the world is complete even in its unseen corners. We believe in the Rebellion because the people who created it believed first, cared enough to fill in details that most would never notice. This dedication to craft honored the story and honored the audience, trusted that care would show even if specific details stayed hidden. Why does the Rebellion endure across generations, across cultures, across the decades since that first film appeared? Perhaps because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the desire to matter, to stand for something larger than ourselves, the hope that courage and compassion can overcome cruelty and fear, the belief that ordinary people contain extraordinary potential, that together we can face darkness and emerge into light. These truths are simple but not simplistic, obvious but not trivial. They sustain us during difficult times and remind us during easy ones that vigilance matters, that freedom requires tending like a garden or it withers. The Rebellion shows us that you don't need special powers or chosen one status to be a hero. You just need to care enough to try, to stand up when standing up is hard, to help when helping costs something. Every rebel technician keeping ships flying, every intelligence officer gathering information, every pilot climbing into a cockpit knowing the odds, every leader making impossible decisions, they were all just people who decided that tyranny would not have the final word. Their collective choice, repeated day after day across years of struggle, changed the galaxy. As you drift now into peaceful rest, let the Rebellion's story settle gently around you like a soft blanket. Remember that you carry this tale with you, that it lives in your imagination as surely as it lives anywhere, the hope it represents, the courage it celebrates, the promise that ordinary beings working together can accomplish the extraordinary. These gifts are yours to keep. The Rebellion endures not just in films and shows, but in every heart that refuses to accept that darkness must win, that injustice must stand, that fear must rule. Sleep now, gentle soul, and dream of stars. Dream of brave pilots flying toward hope. Dream of hidden bases where people build the future they want to see. Dream of a galaxy saved not by one hero but by thousands of heroes, each contributing what they could, each mattering in ways large and small. The Rebellion's greatest victory wasn't destroying the Empire. It was proving that caring matters, that trying matters, that standing together, we are never truly powerless. This truth glows softly in the darkness like distant stars, constant and patient and kind. Let it comfort you as you rest. Let it remind you that hope is not naive but necessary, not foolish but brave. The Rebellion endures because hope endures, and hope endures because people like you, like all of us, choose to keep it alive. Rest well, dreamer, and may the Force be with you always.